Hi. I decided to look at Meg Rosoff's How I Live Now because that's one of the novels that I chose for my selection this class. I originally thought this discussion assignment sounded like a riddle I had to solve because all plot-driven stories have characters and all character-driven stories have plot. But I decided to look at what's driving this story. Because if it's character driven, the character is swept along by the plot or not in charge of the plot, but the character's in charge of how she responds and reacts to the plot. So Meg Rosoff's How I Live Now, I believe, is character driven. And it's interesting that Kurt Vonnegut's Shape of Stories certainly the initial conflict for How I Live Now starts right at the beginning. It seems like Cinderella because we've got a wicked stepmother and she's being sent to live with her cousin, sent away because her wicked stepmother's pregnant, and Rosoff does a really great job with voice. But that's not that much of a conflict. So I would say that it's not actually Cinderella where you start below the axis of good fortune. Right at the beginning, she's being sent to live with cousins, and she instantly gets along with her cousins. So she starts at the axis above the axis in good fortune. And then when we get into the central conflict, so the initial conflict of having to go live with her cousins doesn't even really feel like a conflict. In fact, Rosoff introduces this idea of that she's anorexic and has an eating disorder because in the absence of conflict, it almost seems ludicrous to keep on with the eating disorder, but it's her conflict and she doesn't have enough conflict, so she has to have that conflict inside herself with the eating disorder. But that's a whole other, that eating disorder, so it's subtext, but still poignant. And anyhow, so the initial conflict isn't that much of a conflict because she gets along with her cousins when she's sent to live with them. The central conflict is the fact that she's in this world where there's a war, and then the war actually ends up occupying the country, England, that she's been sent to, and she's separated from her cousins, specifically Edmund, who she's formed an intense relationship with. So, the plot set up from the first pages with this yucky stepmother being sent away thing, but the conflict doesn't really start until they're separated by war. And then it is still character driven because it's how she takes care of her littlest cousin, Piper, who's only 9 years old, and she grows through how she deals with that. So anyhow, that's How I Live Now. And I like the way Rosoff, what did I write down here? About the title. The central question of the story, I feel like it is in the title, How I Live Now. And initially we think it's how she lives now. She's living with her cousins. But Rosoff comes full circle with it and ends with that concept because the premise of the story seems to be how change changes us, which seems kind of trivial, but sometimes it does take an external to change the internal, and the internal was like the eating disorder and stuff like that. So anyhow, that's what I thought of How I Live Now.